Welcome to episode 27 of our reflections on the Psalms, and perhaps more importantly, our next kind of addition to this wonderful 23rd Psalm. We've been taking quite a bit of time looking at this, as you've noticed, almost down to verse by verse, largely because this Psalm is so incredibly significant and so telling that I think it deserves that kind of attention. And of course, historically, when you meet writers who have worked on the Psalms, this is kind of a stopping point, the Psalm, 23rd Psalm, where a great deal more work is done. And we've been looking at this verse by verse until this episode we come at verse 4. And just to give you an understanding of that verse, this is what it says: "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Now, to be honest, when I was a kid reading this, and even as a young Christian, I'd have thought that the valley of the shadow of death was just like a term people used, when we talk about death. There was no such thing as a valley of the shadow of death. It was just a kind of a writer's kind of liberty, if you like, a license to just explain the passage of death, if you like. But having read Kenneth Bailey and other writers who write about this, they said in the Middle East there were such things as valleys of shadows of death, and they said these were real places. In fact, he goes as far as to say back in the 1950s there was a tragedy that occurred in one of these valleys. 50 French tourists were caught in one of these valleys in Petra, which was a city outside southern Jordan, and it was quite big news at the time. And then there was an Armenian shepherd boy, an unusual name, Meshech Paul Krikorian. From those little humble beginnings, Krikorian himself went on to be a writer and an evangelist and one thing and another, and very much a preacher-teacher. In a particular book that he wrote called The Spirit of the Shepherd, he actually goes into detail describing one of these valleys of death. So to give you an idea, let me read to you what he says, which I think really does an incredible job to graphically picture what probably David had in his mind when he wrote about the valley of the shadow of death. Krikorian says this: "There is an actual valley of the shadow of death in Palestine, and every shepherd knows of it. I had the good fortune of having at least a passing view of this valley. It is a very narrow defile through a mountain range, where the water often foams and roars. Torn by jagged rocks, the path plunges downward into a deep and narrow gorge of sheer precipices, overhung by frowning sphinx-like battlements of rocks, which almost touch overhead. Its side walls rise like the stone walls of a great cathedral. The valley is about 5 miles long, yet it is not more than 12 feet at the widest section of the base. The actual path on the solid rock is so narrow that in places the sheep can hardly turn around in case of danger." What a graphic picture you have. You imagine walking one of these narrow gorges, walls right up there, hundreds of feet high, and the rocks coming over, almost closing off the sky from you. And while you walk this path, this narrow path, at the widest point is 12 feet. So at some points it may only be a couple of feet as you kind of wind through. At any given point, waters could break into that valley. You have got no escape whatsoever. And that has been known to happen. Sometimes falling rocks can suddenly be disturbed, and you've no way to escape. Gorian says that there's places not even a sheep could turn around, never mind a human being. And then, of course, there's potential bandits that can sometimes dog those paths, particularly for tourists or anybody else walking them. And these aren't paths that last a couple of hundred yards. As Krikorian says, some of these paths 5 miles long. Can you imagine walking in that sense of anticipated fear for 5 miles? That gives you a really good idea of what David is trying to describe and define when he says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." He's not talking about having a bad week. He's not talking about having a bad month. He's talking about a course of life that can sometimes happen. He's talking about being in a place where you feel like you're never going to get out of this. Travelers are often encouraged to march very slowly and silently through these valleys, so says Krikorian and Bailey in their writings, in order to not be seen or heard by bandits. So you imagine going through these valleys. Not only does it look intimidating, narrowness, the high walls, the jagged rocks above, all these kinds of things, perhaps things you've heard from others going into these valleys, got to be careful, watch out for rains, watch out for the rocks. But you're also walking through knowing that you have to remain silent because there are a kind of untoward elements and bandits who could very much be patrolling, if you like, these areas. In this sense, of course, the fear of death would be constantly on your mind. There would be a sense in which between the elements and the bandits and everything else, you will be feeling, expecting, anticipating trouble at any point. And sometimes, most likely, it'll be unannounced. Nobody sends a warning out. You're not going to hear a load of commotion prior to it and think, it's all right, we've got multiple escape routes here. You've nowhere to go. You realize that you can't turn around, you can't get through. The depth of anticipated fear can almost be paralyzing. And that's the thing that I think David is trying to say here. You and I may have had the misfortune of being in a place of having incredible fear. I know when, as I said in the other episodes, when I was very unwell, I think it was one of the first times in her life my wife said she genuinely felt fear, not knowing what she can do. She's in a situation where I was in the hands of professional medical people. She had no idea what to do about that. And that's, I think, what adds to the paralyzing element of fear. It's not only the situation that can be foreboding and difficult, but it's that sense of impotence that I can't change this. I think sometimes when things frighten us and we can change it, we can confront it, we can get rid of it, we can amass forces against it, if you like. In that sense, it makes it that little bit less foreboding. But when you're faced with something you cannot defeat, you have no way of controlling it. And of course, when you're in one of these valleys, if that water gushes into that valley, if them rocks start to fall, you have nowhere to go. And this is the element. So in the last episode, we looked at the sheep fearing when lost, potential predators, and they're bleating, and the shepherd has to find them. The race is on, you remember, to find them before any predators do. In this particular verse, David's talking about another kind of fear, a fear of passing through places that are unfamiliar, uncontrollable, not able to contain what's going to happen or foresee it. It can be a suffocating fear, can't it, when we live like that? It's like I've met with families who have described to me when their husband or wives have been given a diagnosis. It's that hanging fear of how long will we have, and is this the day when it could all end? I have a friend who only lives a couple of doors down from us who suffered 2 heart attacks relatively quickly. And his wife lives with the fear that maybe today, maybe his 3rd and fatal heart attack. And that sense of fear that says, what if this is our last day? Or what if this happens now and we can't control it? And this is something of what this picture David's building. When you are living with that anxiety, it intensifies and exaggerates the fear beyond our ability to correctly cope with it, really. Bailey says that the valley of death, of darkness, is a section of the trail that cannot be avoided. There is no bypass road. There is no magical escape. And again, this is the sense of as you walk into this valley, you realize that once you're in it, you cannot get out of it. You cannot hope for a magical route or an opening in the rock a third the way down that will lead you out into an open space. The only way through this is to go through it. And that is really tough for those of us who enter into dark valleys, who feel the anticipated gripping fear. And yet encouragingly, this is the encouraging part, David doesn't tell us that this is where the road ends. You notice what he says? Even though I pass through the valley of the shadow of death. There is the only confidence David holds is that he will pass through it. He doesn't say, even though I stay, even though I fall, even though I remain in the valley. He says, even though I pass through. He has a confidence that God will bring him through such a difficult place. And sometimes I think all of us find ourselves in these kinds of valleys. As I've said, it's not just being in a place of fear, but it's the intensification of that when we realize we cannot change that, we cannot combat it, we cannot alter it, we cannot compromise it. It comes full force and we just have to hold on and go through it. And you think to yourself, what confidence have you got not to be crippled by such a thing, not to be paralyzed by such a thing? Well, I'm going to look at that next week, because David in verse 5, he opens up why and where his confidence comes from. But in this moment, he is able to say an outstanding thing, and it's this: even though I pass through the valley of the shadow of death, he's capturing a picture of one of the most frightening environments a shepherd in the Middle East would ever dread to find themselves in, to be locked in one of these valleys of the shadow of death. David says, even though I'm there, I will fear no evil. That's an outstanding statement, because it's a statement of great boldness and confidence, isn't it? David doesn't say, I'm hoping that I won't be afraid. I'm kind of assuming that maybe God will help me enough and I won't feel the fear. He says, I will not fear. I will not fear any evil, which is incredible confidence based on an understanding of the nature of his God. And this is what again leaks through and sometimes screams through Psalm 23, that David is gathering himself in a place of great confidence with God. And we have seen this time and time again. If you've listened to the previous episodes, you'll understand David comes to many points in these Psalms where he expresses incredible confidence in God. The New Testament, of course, gives each of us a great encouragement against such valleys. And I suppose when we look at the work of Jesus, the number one valley is the valley of sin and death. And the Bible tells us in passages like Corinthians 15 and others that he has conquered that fear of death. He has conquered. He has taken the sting of death and the formidable slavery of sin from us, that we are no longer slaves of such. We are no longer captives against our own will. We are no longer driven, uncontrollably by this force of evil. But Jesus has released us. We have confidence. We have life from that, to the degree that we appreciate that there is no pit that is deep enough now, no valley dark enough, if you like, and certainly no danger large enough that is beyond the redemptive reach of Jesus into our own lives. And this is where something of the confidence of David is stirred. You may be listening to this thinking, the situation I'm in now is one of incredible difficulty. I live every day with great anxiety. I live every evening with anticipated fear of what could happen. I feel spiritually paralyzed by this. I can't go forward. There's no way for me to retreat and go backwards. I seem to be stuck in this valley. I can hear the roaring of water. I'm thinking, if this pushes through, I've had it. I hear rumblings of rocks. I'm sure there's bandits on the horizon. I can hear the movement of rock. I think there could be an avalanche any minute. And yet all I can do is continue to walk through this narrow gorge with no way of escape and no confirmation or comfort or promise of relief. What a place to be in. This is David passing through the valley of the shadow of death. Can I encourage you? I think you can find a confidence David found. He said, I will fear no evil. There was confidence that didn't come from a change in circumstance. You see that? He is still in the valley. He's still walking with great anxiety and anticipated fear. But even in that valley, he says, I will fear no evil. The great thing about grace is it doesn't have to move you out of a situation to change how you see that situation or feel in it. It actually meets you in the situation. It walks with you in the anxiety. It surrounds you in the darkness and the uncertainty. I think that when I face my worst moments, ideally I'd have said, God, just heal me and get me out of this intensive care. But in actual fact, I found that grace was right there with me. The goodness of God right alongside me. And I think today, as you have read this psalm and read this verse, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. David said, even though I find myself in what I think is the worst place to be, which would be in one of such valleys, I can fear no evil. I have confidence that God is with me. That's my prayer for you today. You'll have the confidence that God is with you in the darkest and worst of the places. God bless you.